So, but you know, it was just it was kind of calm for a couple of years, and then around the sort of the end of 43, 40, beginning of 44, things started to get a little more um, serious, and uh, some people were disappearing, some people, and my father, and that was when we stopped um, being able to see my father. And he also got passes to come and visit us um, before that, maybe once every 2 or 3 months, but all that stopped. Um, and somebody said to me, why didn't your father escape? Why didn't he just go up to the hills and become a guerrilla? And I said, you got to remember, my father was a very tall man. He was 6'4". You don't escape into the Philippines when you're 6'4" and everybody else around you is 5'4" or 5'5". You're a moving target. My father said, I would never pass. I could never hide. I would have to be hidden by someone. So he said I had to go back to the camp. So
There's no way that he would have
it was no way.
escaped.
There was no way he could.
A huge Scottish man.
He could blend in, as he said, and he had to wear an armband when he left the camp, saying what he was. He had to wear that one when he left, so he could be identified.
Yeah. So escaping was more or less just wishful thinking for him.
Yeah, and we all were given. We were all given. Well, I wasn't, but my mother was given a little certificate that she had to carry with her at all times. With it was on identification papers written in Japanese and in English. Said who she was, and she had permission to be outside. You know, that sort of thing. So that's how they kept an eye. And I'm sure my grandmother had it too. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that people had to have. So when the crackdown started to come, then there were more soldiers on the streets, barricades, that kind of sort of stuff happened.
So why did they start cracking down on the civilian population in the Philippines in the last couple of years of the war?
I think they were afraid of retaliation in some ways, because they knew that the Filipinos did not buy into the Japanese occupation. They did it in a kind of a quiet way, and in some cases they made fun of the Japanese, but they did it so that the Japanese didn't think they were making fun of them. The Filipinos were really loyal to the Philippines and to the United States at that point. They weren't buying into it. So that's when the Japanese started probably worrying, oh, well, they could band together and destabilize us. And the guerrillas in the mountains were doing their job, and they were coming into the cities and doing things in the cities. So I think they were afraid of what the Filipinos would do. That's what I think. I mean, I don't know. I can't prove it, but it's got to be logical. And they kept an eye on different people. I think they kept an eye certainly on our family and other families like ours, who they knew where the sympathies lay. And so they would watch. I'm sure we were being watched all the time in case my uncle Joe particularly ever came back from Australia or snuck in or something. But he never did. He never came back. He never tried to come to the Philippines during the war. So they kept an eye on everybody.
Yeah, and I think your family members were eventually arrested by the Japanese, right? So tell me about how that happened and what ended up happening.
Well, that happened around 1944. Well, let's see, around September of 1944. There's one thing I do remember. We saw some planes started flying around over us, bigger planes, not fighter planes, but bigger planes. And we could tell they weren't Japanese planes, because the Japanese planes had a symbol of the rising sun, and they were American planes, and they were dropping leaflets, kind of things of. I wish I had a leaflet. I don't. That's something I'm going to see if I can find, saying, okay, we're coming. Hang on. We're with you. That sort of thing. So around September, uh, that's when things were starting to turn. And then a month later was the end of October, was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the big naval battle that happened, where the U.S. Navy defeated the Japanese Navy, or they defeated it pretty substantially, and then the rest fled. And then that's when MacArthur, soon after that, landed on Leyte, which is in the middle of the Philippines. So all this happened all of a sudden, very, very suddenly. And then the Japanese were really worried about an invasion. So that's November and December and January, they started cracking down. And then I don't know exactly when, maybe in December, General Yamashita, who had been in command of the Japanese army in Luzon, was sent further north. He took his troops, he went further north, and he left Manila. He left Admiral Iwabuchi in charge of Manila. So Yamashita went north. Yamashita was famous for his for when he invaded Singapore. So but he had some problems, and he had a record and he'd also been in China, and he had a terrible record of what he had done in China. So his reputation was not the greatest, but anyway, he was sent up to the north of Luzon, which is the main Philippine island, and Iwabuchi came in, who also had a bad reputation of things that he had done, had lost a battle or two or something. Anyway, that's when the crackdown really began in Manila. Some of the massacres started occurring in different parts of Manila. And then it was home invasions, killing everybody, going into churches, killing all the priests, killing all the parishioners, going to hospitals, burning down houses, just a reign of terror, really. And that went through, and that's when my family were arrested at the end of January. And I think they were one of the families that had been targeted as eliminate them kind of thing. So we were one of many families that were hit. So that happened at the end of January, and then the MacArthur's landing in the northern part of Luzon, and then the American troops coming into Manila in the 1st of February. So that's the sort of the general overall sequence of what happened.
Yeah. And so, did you ever get to see any of your family members that were taken away again?
No, never. They were taken away. It was approximately about half a mile away. There was a big street, two or three streets over from us, called Taft Avenue. It was named after President Taft, and Taft, who had been, I think, a governor general in Manila. And it was a big, busy street. The Philippine General Hospital was on that street. The other schools were on that street. It was just a two-way big thoroughfare. And the Masonic Temple, which had been built in the 30s, was on that street, and that's where they were taken. They had to walk there. so that's where they were, and uh, we tried we brought food to them. I didn't, but my brothers and the um, couple of people who worked for us would take food every day, and that happened for about a week, and then they told us not to come back. So we assumed that that's where they were killed at the end. But we have documents from the U.S. government that said that they were not killed there, that they were killed at a place called Fort Santiago, which was in the old city of Manila. We can't confirm that. It might have happened. It may not have happened. We're not 100% sure about that.
So which of your family members were arrested?
My grandmother, Angelina, my mother, Consuelo, my aunt Helen, my uncle Alfred, my aunt Helen's fiance, whose family a week or 2 weeks later were also totally, they killed everybody in his family. A friend of my grandmother's who was living with us at the time. And Anna, my ama, and all our household help were arrested. And then they released my two brothers and Anam and the household help. And they just kept them. So, and then
were your two older brothers?
Yeah.
So
No, they claim that they found a radio and a gun, which, probably a radio. I doubt a gun. But anyway, that's what they found.
That's what that was their reason for arresting your family.
Yeah. But we think it was a reason because the family had been on a list of, a watch list, and then it was time to get rid of them.
Yeah. So, but why was it illegal to have a gun and a radio?
Oh, sure, absolutely illegal to have a gun, illegal to have a radio. Oh yeah, but everybody had a radio, and they hid the radio. And I don't know how many people had guns. Probably very few people with guns. I doubt if he had a gun, because if he'd had a gun, it would have been something that he'd had when he was in the fighting in Bataan. But they would have taken that away from him. So he might have had a knife or something, but I doubt it. A radio for sure.
Yeah. So why was it illegal to have a radio? Because they didn't want the Filipinos to be listening to news from elsewhere.
Yeah, to communicate, and maybe some people, get news from abroad. That's basically what it was, and to counteract the propaganda that the Japanese were handing out. Yeah, to just find out what's going on, because there you are, you don't know anything. So.
Yeah. And so were your two older brothers the ones that were initially arrested?
Yes. Yeah. They were. And then they were let go. So when they got back, there were no adults they were all gone. So at that time, a lot of the fires had started in the neighborhood. And a lot of our neighbors came to our house because it was still there. And some of them had no homes, so they either camped out in the garden or they came under the house with us. That's where we lived, under the house. So, and occasionally would come out, when there was, because you never knew when, a bomb would be dropped or somebody would attack. So we stayed under the house.
Yeah. And so why do you think that the children weren't arrested?
Well, my other brother who was a year and a half older than I was, he and I were not at the home. We were at a neighbor's house. So with Anna, no, wait a minute. Yeah, we were at a neighbor's house, playing at a neighbor's house. And I think my mother sent us there on purpose. Things were getting really risky and not good. And so I think that she just sent us there, just thinking, well, I'd send the kids over there to play or something. And it was the day they were arrested.
Yeah.
You'd seen, for instance, the street in front of our house was more or less not a major street, but it was a pretty big street. And the one in behind us was a smaller street. And so we could, and the houses were built, some of the lots were divided in half, but we happened to have one of the lots that went from the front street to the back street. And we would be able to look outside the back street to the back street. And there, that's when they had the telephone poles, and they would tie people up the telephone poles and shoot them, and they would just leave them there and die. So we knew that was happening. And the barricades were up, and a lot of Japanese soldiers patrolling the streets. You couldn't get from one street to another. You'd have to go through barricades. So they pretty much barricaded us in.
Yeah. And do you remember what you thought or what you felt when you came back to your house and then found that everybody was gone?
Oh my God, it was horrible because we didn't get back till around 7 o'clock at night. And the house was a mess. Every drawer had been pulled out, dumped out on the floor. The whole entire house had been searched. The kitchen with pots and pans were all over the place. It was a mess. And I don't know and if they found a radio, where they found the radio, but they had searched the house thoroughly. And that was in January. So we also had, which was interesting because when we also would have, prior to that, a couple of months before that, we had Japanese soldiers who came to visit us, I call it, to just, and then they would leave. But the ones who were the scariest were the Filipinos, who were the collaborators. They were called makapilis, and they would come in at night, usually around 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And they would have their faces covered with, some of them with masks that they would put on. And then they would loot the house. They'd find something they liked, they would just take it, and terrify. They were terrifying. And they hid themselves because they were the ones who would, who, as I said, collaborated with the Japanese, and also they could they didn't want to be identified by anybody, so you never knew who they were. So they did that several times.
Did they ever come to your house?
Oh yeah, oh sure. And then after that, my grandmother said we had some silver that she had, like spoons and forks and knives and spoons, and so she dug a hole in the garden and she buried a bunch of stuff like that. So but yeah, they'd come. Yeah, they attacked everybody that came in. They were a menace. I don't think they ever killed anybody, but they stole, and they listened, and they told on each. That's why they didn't want to be identified. So that and they would listen to people, and you never knew who a makapili was, so you had to keep your mouth shut, so that you wouldn't say anything that would come back and get you into trouble.
Yeah. And so was your ama with you and your brother when you came back to the house?
Yes. Excuse me, my ama was not arrested because my ama was with us when we left for the day. Excuse me, I made that mistake. Let me correct that. She was with us at the house. So she came back with us and straightened it all out. And then what happened after that is that the other household most of them decided to go back. Most of them came from the outlying provinces, and they went back to their provincial home. And my ama stayed with us, and my grandmother's housekeeper stayed with us, and our driver stayed with us. And that was it. Everybody else went home.
Yeah. And do you remember feeling scared or missing your grandmother, when you came back and found that they were gone and the house is a mess?
I have to say that that I remember the house being such a mess, and I just nothing. No, I guess I was scared, but that's part of my recollection that I don't recollect. I don't how I felt. You know, because I had Anam with me, who was always with me, and so I felt protected with her.
Is that your mama?
My Ama, yeah, yeah. So, and what happened was my brother, who was age 13 at the time, he took control. I mean, he and Anam were the head of the families. That's it. They he was the one who became the head of the family
Yeah.
at 13. Did a good job.
Yeah, up until your dad came back, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so, why do you think that your two older brothers were released and referred not to
I
be?
don't, you know, I asked my brother that, and he said he thinks it's because my grandmother talked the Japanese into letting them go. I'm not sure. I mean, I think they were lucky, thank God,
Yes.
because they were, you know, they were adolescents, preteen. Well, 13-year-old boy is not very um, doesn't look like a man just yet, you know, but certainly he boys of that age could be trouble. And I think my grandmother said, just sort of made a deal with them or something. I don't know why. But suddenly they were released and came home. Um, so, but I do remember my brother one time when we were underneath the house. A man was there was some shelling going on, and a man was brought in underneath the house. He was badly injured, and there was a doctor there amongst all the neighbors who lived around us. Several doctors, I guess, and they were trying to save him. And my brother, at 13, was one of the people who was there helping the doctors. So I don't think the man survived. Um, so those are the kind of things that happen. You know, you rise to your abilities. Um, and my brother did that. You know, he bossed us around. We keep telling him he bossed us around, which was good. And my other older brother, who was 12, because they were a little over a year apart, he had other strengths. He had a way of um, during the occupation, he'd get cigarette. God knows where he got the cigarettes, but he got cigarettes, and he'd go around selling cigarettes and making a little pocket money. So that was his expertise. You know, being on the black market, buying something and selling it for a profit. But anyway, that's what you do.
Your father and your other uncle, who was with MacArthur's team, eventually came back, right? So, can you tell me what you remember, like, of how your father or what you know about how your father got released, and then?
Well, my father was still at the camp when MacArthur came in. When the American troops came into Manila, the first place they liberated was the Santo Tomas internment camp, because there had been rumors that the Japanese were going to exterminate all the over 2,000 prisoners who were there, whether they were going to machine gun them, I don't know. They were going to get rid of them all. So MacArthur went in there to liberate Santo Tomas first, and then the internees there had to stay there because the fighting was still going on, so they weren't able to leave. But it was under the Americans at the time, after they came and liberated the camp. So they were staying there. My father was still there. They didn't know what the heck was going on in the rest of Manila, because this was the February 3rd when they liberated Santo Tomas, and the Battle of Manila went on for a month. So they didn't know what the hell was going on, and they just stayed put. So anyway, when we left our house and got to the American lines around the middle of February, sort of, we sort of camped out in the rubble and, waiting for somebody to tell us what to do. And then that's when we ran into my cousin, my mother's first cousin, who saw us in the middle of this rubble. And he took us to my father in Santo Tomas. And we walked and we finally got a ride, somebody's truck, and got there. And that's when we were reunited with my father. He had no idea where we were. He had no idea who was still alive. None of it, because there was no information coming into Santo Tomas at the time. He was just waiting and waiting and waiting. So that, and so the four of us and Anam appeared at Santo Tomas, and that's when we had our reunion with my father. I remember we went to the gates, and somebody said, "Oh yes, I know. We'll go get him. He's up. We'll go get your father." And we were just waiting there at the gates. And my father showed up, and I hadn't seen my father for quite a while, and I kind of didn't recognize him because he lost a lot of weight. And my brothers immediately recognized him, so they ran to him, and then Anam said, "That's your father. That's your father." So that's how we got reunited. And by then, a lot of his friends had heard that we'd arrived, so they came and they were greeting us too. So we told Dad, he said, "Where's your mom? Where's your mom?" And we said, "We don't know. We don't know where she is." So it was a very emotional reunion. So we lived in Santo Tomas for, there was no other place to go. So my brothers moved into where my father was living in the gymnasium, and Anam and my younger brother and I went to live in another area where they had women and children. But we saw each other all the time, and we were there until we stayed in Santo Tomas until I think May, when they started clearing up a lot of the debris and our house was still standing. That was the miracle. So we went back there to live, moved in May, but still it was a mess. The house was torn apart inside, looted. The looters had come in and taken everything. But that's where we lived. We moved in.
Yeah. And so after reuniting with your dad, why couldn't you go back to your house?
Because there was still a lot of unexploded hand grenades. There was a lot of dead bodies around there. They had to clean up the area before we could go back. A lot of destroyed houses. So they had to do that before it was before we could go back to the neighborhood. Still in pretty bad, horrible shape. So that's why.
Yeah. And so after the Philippines was liberated, when did it finally occur to you, the surviving members of your family, that the rest of the family was, dead and they weren't coming back?
Well, my uncle had heard and had been to the Masonic temple, but he never identified any of the bodies. But he was told that there were over 100 bodies down in the basement, or there had been killed. So he assumed that was, that they were there. But but it had been over a month. So identifying the bodies at that point was just not able to do it properly. So we just assumed I always thought my mother had escaped. She'd gone up to the mountains. And we always talked that, mom's up there, they escaped. But as it went on, we realized that, that probably wasn't happening. And then 2 years later, my father remarried. And that was when we kind of said, okay, I guess she's not coming back. in a child's mind, you go, oh, well, I guess that she's not coming back. So that's what happened.
Yeah. And do you remember how you felt when it finally sunk in that your mom was not coming back?
Yeah, when my father got married again, yeah.
Yeah. And do you remember how you felt?
Yeah, I felt extremely sad. But the way it was told to me, and as a child, you hear these things, and but your life is going on as a child. I was being loved and protected, and so I knew she wasn't coming back, but I didn't. That didn't hit me till maybe 20 years later. Wow, she'll never come back. And then I've got to find out what happened to her. That's when my mind started thinking, what happened to her. So as a child, I didn't just process it as much as I should have. Only because I think as a child, you're protected in some ways, especially when you have a family around you who protects you from that. I knew that she'd gone. I knew she'd died. I knew the war had happened. I knew that. So, I just but the nice thing about it is that I always had, my stepmother knew my mother. So she always talked about her and told me stories, and always had her picture. We always had my mom's picture around us. So she was always part of our family. It was not a thing like, oh, well, she can't be part of it. We can't have a picture of her. I always had, and we've talked about her openly. So it was kind of, it was a bittersweet. It was not, but when I got to be older, then I really realized all that I had missed. And then I had a couple of friends who had lost their mothers also, and we would talk about it.
Yeah. And how old were you when your father remarried?
9. I was 9 years old.
Yeah. So was it like right after the war, or was it like a couple years?
Yeah, a couple of years after the war. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that it was a good decision that he made. He married a woman who really had known my mother and had people liked her. My mother's family, my uncle and aunt liked her. She was a good woman. A good person to have come into our life. I mean, that would have been. I said to her one time, I said, "Gosh, what were you thinking, marrying a man with 4 children?" I mean, that was a big. She had been married before, but had never had any children. I said, "What was that like?" And she said, I didn't when I'd known your dad and I know your mother and she's but the 4 of you. She said at one point, she said, I didn't know whether I loved the 4 of you more than I loved your father. She loved us, and she loved being a mother. She was pretty strict, and I'm sure my mother probably would have been strict too. But that was good. I mean, you always knew she was on your side. She never wavered as far as that was concerned. She did everything she could to nurture us. So, and later on, and she became actually the matriarch of our family. And she was never considered. Well, she was well loved by everybody. And the best part of it was when she had, I think, when all of us got married, and then we had our grandchildren. We had the grandchildren, and then she just loved that because she was a grandmother, and so we were lucky. We were lucky that my father chose. There were some other women. My aunt told me years later. She said there were a lot of women after your father. They all wanted to marry your father. She said, "Oh no, my God, some of them would have been disasters." So we were lucky. really lucky.